welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, it's been described as a dance of democracy, an unparalleled logistical feat, etc. But what is indisputable is that given the complex web of caste, class, language, ethnicity, religion, economic performance, you name it, it's close to impossible to put a finger on what really decides electoral outcomes. But this is a program that focuses on economics, macroeconomics. So over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to discuss the relationship, if any, between economic performance and electoral outcomes. In the US, Bill Clinton, former president, reportedly won the 1992 election with his catchline, "It's the economy, stupid." Would such similar tagline get any traction at all in India? Does the ordinary voter today care about GDP growth, fiscal deficit, current account deficit, and all the other things that economists really agonize over? And what better way to find out than by asking three argumentative economists who also keep a close tab on politics. So let me welcome to the show R. Jagannathan, Editorial Director, Swarajya Magazine, TCA Srinivasa Raghavan, Senior Journalist, known for his acerbic comments, and Arun Kumar, former Economics Professor, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Let me start by asking each of you in turn for a brief opening comment. Does economic performance matter at all when it comes to electoral outcomes? When it comes to a scale of 1 to 10, of the various factors that really weigh in with voters in India, where would you rank economic performance? Among the top 5 factors, or a low 9 or 10? Or does it not matter at all? Let me start with you, Jaggi.
Yeah, I would say that economic performance is ranked somewhere in the middle. That is, without it, you will have a problem of getting yourself elected. But with it, there is no guarantee that you will be elected. So even if you have high growth and even high dispersal of incomes as a result of that growth, there is no guarantee that you will win an election, because there are several other factors that matter to the voter, which could include caste, religion, and all the other things that you mentioned. I mean, in the more recent case, we have had, there is a certain amount of urban happiness with the post-Pulwama response of this government, this muscular response. It's sort of vibes well with the urban middle class. So a lot of things do matter. I would say economic growth and development is a necessary condition for you to be able to do well in an election, but it is simply not a sufficient reason for anybody to vote for you.
Okay, TCA Jaggi's put it in economics jargon, necessary but not a sufficient condition. But in the speeches given by Prime Minister Modi at various fora this month, economic issues and his government's success, quote unquote, in turning around the economy doesn't seem to find much mention at all. Doesn't mean that the government itself doesn't give much store by economic performance. So what is your score? And are we an outlier unlike the US on this, TCA?
Well, from what I know of Narendra Modi, he is personally very convinced that what cost the BJP the 2004 election was the India Shining campaign. And that, if you recall, was mainly about economic performance, thumping your chest about what a great job the BJP had done. Now, if that seems to be the case, then it is reasonable to expect the BJP not to focus too much on all the sort of shining achievements, but to focus on the smaller things, big from their point of view, small from an economist's point of view, like service delivery, you know, the electricity, reaching gas cylinders, roads, that sort of thing. So if you count that as economic performance rather than management performance, then yes, economic performance counts. But fundamentally, right from the start, this government has focused on the management of economic deliverables rather than the larger thing, which on which they've been actually pretty good. I mean, you know, if 10 years from now, somebody like Little and Joshi writes a book, they would say that, look, inflation was down, and that's one of the most important things. Fiscal deficit was kept under control. That's the other important thing. But just one final thing before you say a third, okay. Arun is on the thing, he's an economist. The question that you are asking, the econometricians have an answer for it through that thing called Granger causality, which separates the causal effects in an equation. So perhaps somebody should run that, maybe Surjit Bhalla could, and find out exactly how much economics affects electoral outcomes. If nothing else, it will make an interesting read.
You know, Arun, though the peg is a forthcoming election, I'm not even talking about this particular government or this particular election. In general, for countries like India, does the economic performance matter? What is your sense, and how much of a weight would you give it, Arun?
You know, economic performance matters up to a point. However, elections are all about political perception.
Okay.
And sometimes economic perception is trounced by political perception, you know. And if you look at what has happened in the last 5 years, you had two big shocks in the economy that actually damaged the unorganized sector no end. And therefore, what you had was a problem of unemployment, which was growing. And therefore, the government has not been releasing the data pertaining to Mudra loans, employment, pertaining to NSSO, etc. You know, the government was very worried about it, and that's why in the interim budget it has given to farmers, it has given to the unorganized sector, it has given to the middle classes, etc., to try to correct the perception that because all these sections were hurting, and therefore the government is trying to do that. So in that sense, economics matters. However, what the government also has done is to affect the political perception, you know. And that is where, you know, the Balakot strike has come in favor of the government, and the government has, you know, tried to use that. And therefore, in a sense, what I'd say is, at the end of the day, it's the political perception of how you manage the economy, how you are able to divert attention from the economic issues. Now, it remains to be seen whether the youth, which is worried about unemployment, whether that sees Balakot as more important than the economic performance, the lack of jobs, whether the farmers who are, you know, for them, the price decline, actually the deflation in agriculture
we'll come to
prices.
the details a little later, Arun, because I want to get into some more questions on the specifics. So though we agree and disagree in the extent of importance, the fact is, Jaggi, that even the most severe critics of the government would agree that the government has done a great deal on the reforms front, whether it is GST, the bankruptcy code, monetary policy framework, the new mining policy, all of which are necessary to put growth on a firm footing. But does any of this carry any weight with the ordinary voter, Jaggi?
No, yes and no, in the sense that when all these things start delivering at the level of the last voter, then of course it will matter. But in the interim, you have more of the pain. If the pain is front loaded and the gain is back loaded, which is the exact opposite of what most politicians would want, then actually the voter may not see the benefits. The same thing happened with NDA 1, where I think most of the reforms that happened in the last 4 or 5 years, and the growth was spiked up only in the last year, and the voter hadn't really felt the full benefits of the growth. So they started thumping their chests about India shining a little too soon. Whereas 2 years later, if you had said that, the voter would have said, yeah, some of it is percolating to me. So this is the same problem in NDA 2, that you had 4 years where you struggled. I think the economy is probably about to turn around now after the 2 disruptions of demonetization and GST, but the benefits have not percolated down because of the fact that all the 2 droughts followed by 2 disruptions actually have slowed down the recovery at the level of the last man. So your problem is not at the macroeconomic level, but at when the micro level, these things are not petering out yet, which is why you have to shift the focus outside economics, and that's what the government is trying to do.
Okay, TC, Jaggi touched on a very important issue, that the problem with economic reforms is that many of the benefits accrue only after a lag, while the pain is very often immediate. So does it mean that incumbent governments are condemned to pay the price, quote unquote, rather than reap the reward for economic reforms? TCA.
Well, yes, I mean, he's right. But if you examine what the NDA 2 has done, or what Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaitley between them have done, they have front-loaded the pain for the big guys, you know, the big industrialists. I don't think at the sort of last voter sort of level, as Jaggi calls it, other than the disruption caused by GST and demonetization, which was huge, I don't think they have done anything to make things worse for them. The one thing they could have avoided was demonetization, because that really hit the last voter. The GST thing probably a little above that. Look, you're talking of 900 million voters, and the real question you have to ask is how many of them are going to be affected either by GST or by demonetization. Demonetization would have had a nationwide impact. GST is a small subset of that. So as far as the voter is concerned, it's very local issues that would be important in my view, plus of course inflation, which runs through the last 72 years as an important political economic issue. Now, having controlled inflation in whatever manner that they have done, they have run into an opposite problem of practically deflation, especially of agricultural prices. This is going to hurt them, I think, and I don't know what the answer is, because if the farmers are going to produce more, then they're going to have to live with lower prices. So there are a whole lot of reforms that need to be done in agriculture if you want to draw a direct link between politics and economics.
Arun, Jaggi talked about what economists call the time inconsistency problem, and TCS says it's always local issues that really matter, even perhaps in a Lok Sabha election. Where would you stand on this, Arun?
You know, as I was beginning to say last time, what has happened with demonetization and GST, the unorganized sector has been impacted very badly, you know. In fact, all data seems to suggest that the rate of growth of unorganized sector is negative. You know, whether you look at the All India Manufacturers Organization, you look at the job losses given by CMIE, the record high unemployment rate that the NSSO data says. So what it means is that 94% of the workforce which is in the unorganized sector, that has suffered a fall in income, and that has resulted in fall in demand. And that is why the rate of growth has become less than 1%. It's not 7% anymore. You know, the 7% was pre-2016, the demonetization. Okay. But these shocks have reduced the rate of growth of the economy. Now, that is impacting the farmers. Okay. So, you know, it's not that we have a surplus of agricultural produce. You find large amount of malnourishment amongst women and children, about 40% according to the latest data. So if they had enough income, they would have consumed more, there would be no surplus. So problem of agriculture is not of surplus or production more, but it's the lack of demand coming from the unorganized sector. And that's why what I find is that the deflation in agriculture prices hurt the farmers, the unemployment that has resulted out of this is hurting the youth, and these factors are now playing themselves out. So the kind of GST that we have, which leaves out the unorganized sector, actually is creating the problem, because the unorganized sector is hurting, you know. So both demonetization and GST have hurt the unorganized sector, and that is not going to go away soon, and that's why your private investment rate is down.
We'll discuss the details a little later, Arun, simply because I'm running out of time. And it's time for us to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with three stalwarts on does economic performance matter at all to election outcomes in general? The peg, of course, being the forthcoming election. Jaggi, if we all agree, of course in varying degrees, that economic performance does matter, what aspect of this economic performance do you think has a maximum traction with the average Indian voter? Is it inflation, employment? What is it that matters at the grassroots level? Jaggi?
Yeah, I mean, I would suspect that, see, there are two things. One is employment growth and income growth obviously are very big positives if they happen. And right now that's a bit under the cloud, but it's probably going to recover shortly as capital investment recovers. But when it comes to inflation, the voter has a different approach to it. Rising inflation is a problem, but falling inflation is not given any credit as much, because the resultant deflation in large parts of the rural areas, and also because I think if what you already have, a low price regime, you take it for granted. You don't see it as some kind of advantage that the government has given you, even in urban areas. So that's the problem. That is, you get a kick in the butt if prices rise too much, but you don't get a pat on the back when it doesn't rise so much. So that's the other problem. I think the thing that really matters to the voter is the way he sees the benefits of development at his level. So for a rural farmer, it may be wages. For the urban guy, it may be a combination of higher job increments and other things. For the for the farmer, it may be higher prices. So different guys see it differently, and all of it see it as an improvement in my own personal thing in a different way. And unfortunately, all of them cannot happen at the same time in a complex economy like India. And that's what we are seeing right now.
Very true, Jackie, really. But also the fact is, TCA, that jobless growth is seen as one of the biggest charges against the present government. But is it the job of the government to create jobs or to create an enabling environment for growth and then leave it to growth to lead to job creation? TCA.
Look, I've been saying this for a very long time. Don't talk about jobs. Jobs is a political concept. The correct economic concept is incomes. And as Jaggi said, the main thing is what's happening to your incomes. As Arun has been saying, you knocked the bottom out with demonetizations. Incomes went to zero and they are still haven't fully recovered. So if you talk about incomes, it makes far more sense to assess the political impact. Now, therefore, the question is, given that there are 900 million voters, how many of them have suffered a decline in income in the 5 years of the NDA government? This is the question you should be asking. But we don't have any specific numbers for that, but I would suspect that a very large number of them have suffered, if not an actual decline in income, as happened with the bad implementation of GST or demonetization, certainly increments, that is not just the kind of urban corporate or government types of increments, the increase in income that should be happening, that has not happened. And that is going to be a major problem for any candidate who goes and canvasses for a vote. Because at that point, he'll have to shift the attention away from the pain that the voter has felt because his incomes haven't increased to all the little things that they've given. You know, we've given you a gas cylinder, we've given you electricity, we've built a road and so on and so forth. The guy can well turn around and say, well, I can't, yes, toilets, and he can consume, he can turn around and say, I can't consume these things. My income is perhaps stagnant, or maybe it has declined. That, to my mind, is a huge political problem.
Arun, TCA pointed to the rural-urban divide, and it is a fact that the rural voter's perspective very different from that of the urban voter. The reason I ask you this, because when it comes to deciding who comes to office in Delhi, it is the rural rather than the urban voter who counts, since rural seats far outnumber the urban ones. Only 57 of the 542 parliamentary constituencies are really urban, where the rest are all rural and some are semi-urban. So how important is a rural voter's perspective, and has he hurt because of the so-called lack of economic growth?
So, you know, the rural voters, as you rightly said, are very important, and what they are suffering from is that while the prices have declined, their costs have risen, and that's why the income has got squeezed. So in effect, what the farmer is worried about is whether it's receiving the correct income through the implementation of the minimum support price, the MSP mechanism, which doesn't seem to be working. And demonetization impacted that because of cash shortage. Traders don't pay cash immediately, and therefore they have to sell off the produce to the local trader rather than go to the mandi and get the MSP. And anyway, in a lot of mandis, MSP is not working. So the farmers' incomes are what have got squeezed, and I think that's what we need to recognize. Now, that is to the benefit of the workers, because the workers go and buy in the market. But the point is that the trade margins are so high that in urban areas, the prices have not fallen, whereas the MSP is not being achieved in the rural areas. So the workers in the urban areas are affected because the prices of food remain quite high. The farmers are getting affected because of the fact that they're not getting the income that they should get. The youth is worried because it's not getting employment, and without employment, you don't have income. So, the data suggests the demand for Manrega has shot up. In the demonetization year, the allocation was 38,000 crores, you spent 47,000 crores. Next year, you allotted 48,000 crores, you spent 55,000 crores. Then you allotted 55,000 crores, you spent 66,000 crores. And even then, it is said that full wages are not being paid. Now, this shows that the unemployment problem is very high because people have migrated from urban to rural areas, and there they're demanding Manrega work. Second is the credit offtake is very low. And the third is the micro sector, which is the dominant sector. Their unemployment is very high because they don't have working capital. So even though mudra loans have been given, the average mudra loan is only about 45,000 rupee, and that's not enough to create a job. So in other words, the unemployment situation is affecting the income of the youth. The farmers' incomes are affected. The urban areas where the food prices have not dipped corresponding to MSP, they are also affected.
Okay.
And that's why, you have a problem all around.
Sure. TCA, in fact, economists economists, and from our answers you can see that economists have always been criticized for prefacing their answers with on the other one hand, but on the other, so much so that former US President Harry Truman is reported to have pleaded for a one-handed economist. The story, even if apocryphal, is unfair to economists because there's more than one dimension of macroeconomic numbers. Take low inflation, which all of you mentioned. In a country where governments have been voted out of office because of high inflation, low inflation would normally be good news for any government heading into election. But as we've seen, the flip side to this is rural distress. So are voters likely to reward the government for low inflation or punish it for the resultant agricultural distress? TCA.
Well, it's the old problem of consumers versus producers. If producer prices go down, the consumer benefits, and vice versa. So that depends on how many producers of a particular thing are there. And in the case of farmers, obviously there are hundreds of millions of them. Although the farmers are also consumers, they are selling to the other non-farm consumers. So while the consumer benefits by low agricultural prices, the farmer suffers. So it depends on how many of them are there who are suffering. Now in the United States, for example, very few farmers are there. So agricultural prices are not a political issue, they're more a national security issue kind of thing, and they give subsidies, etc., to keep food prices within reasonable limits so that the consumer can benefit. They don't give it so that the producer can benefit. The producer only gets whatever income he would otherwise have got. So in India, we have this structural problem that we've got a hell of a lot of farmers, and if their incomes go down, they are going to vote, well, certainly not for the government, and they're going to be very unhappy. So I think, it's a very tough question, especially in a country like 900 million, India, where there are 900 million voters. It becomes a huge problem to assess the impact of any one or two or even three or four or five aspects that go into a person's decision-making process, which is why earlier on I mentioned that Granger causality thing, which at least if there's some data, you can figure out which matters more, which has a greater causal effect on outcomes.
Jaggi, would you agree? And don't you think that I think in fact all of us would agree that teaching a man to fish is far better than giving him a fish a day. Hence the case for empowerment rather than entitlement. But since empowerment that comes through economic growth takes time, does it always lose out to entitlement as we near elections, as we are seeing with the quasi-universal basic income scheme, the PM Kisan Samman, etc. Jaggi?
Yeah, and it's especially true in the Indian context, where what happens is that voting goes by caste and community things. Since the state is fairly broken and is unable to deliver public goods across the spectrum, the preference among voters is to have a transactional relationship with the politician, where I think they vote to a politician in order to get specific private goods like a reservation here or some higher income there or some subsidy somewhere else. So this is what you get. So because of this factor, what you get is voters are not actually, governments also are focused on delivering short-term benefits to the voter rather than investing for the long term in building capacity, both state capacity and the capacity to deliver a very broad range of public goods like law and order, good roads, good education, good health services. That is where the voter is ruling out. I think both politicians and voters are responsible for this, because they have reduced elections to a transactional relationship where I give you one vote, you have to give me something specific. And since votes are won with 30 and 35% of the vote, the vast majority of people do not get benefits from voting. And this is the basis of all anti-incumbency votes in India.
Arun, would you agree that this is really the problem? That because of this, good economics very often does not translate into good politics. So where does this leave economic growth, economic performance and reforms?
The problem is that India has very poor governance, So even if you have a good economic policy, you're unable to implement it, So this government has had many good things it has announced, like, giving a cylinder to women who used to use a wood fire, toilets and Swachhta Abhiyan, etc. They are very good. But India, we are not able to deliver because of the very, very poor governance. And that's why when you go out in the field and ask people, they say toilet to hai, but we're not using it for that purpose. We're using it as a storeroom, or that, we don't use it because we're habituated to doing something else, etc. So having good economic policies must also mean can't be able to deliver those policies, And we had demonetization which damaged the economy, and then GST is structurally flawed, which has again damaged the economy, and that's why the rate of growth is down to 1%. It's no more 7%. The government's data is only coming from the organized sector. It doesn't take into account the unorganized sector. And now when the government says we don't have any good data on employment, if you don't have good data on employment, you're not measuring the unorganized sector at all. And if you're not measuring, therefore your rate of growth is only dependent on the organized sector. Now, if the rate of growth is down to 1%, then investment will suffer. When investment suffers, then the rate of growth will not pick up in the future. And therefore, what was considered a good, policy like GST is not going to deliver. It's actually proving to be counterproductive. We needed a much simpler one. We said one nation, one tax, and we said many other things, but that has not been what the policy is. You have so many exemptions, petroleum is kept out of it. So how is it a good policy? So A, good policy has to be properly defined, and B, it has to be implemented, and that's where governance is very important.
Arun, I can just remind you what Joan Robinson said about India, that whatever you say about India, the opposite could be just as true. But before I end this program, because we're running out of time, when I started the program, Jaggi was the only one who gave me a number. He said economic performance is somewhere in the middle in a scale of 1 to 10. I didn't get a number from either TCA or Arun, which is what I'm going to ask you, TCA. Where would you rank economic performance in the overall scheme of things, as far as electoral outcomes are concerned? TCA?
Around, on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe 3 to 4.
Okay. Arun?
Yeah, I would say, again, it's a question of political perception. Economic perception, political perception have to go together. If they go together, then the economic performance will matter. You get 8, but if it doesn't, then 2.
Oh my God, not a very happy day for all of us economists over here, but I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. So I'll have to end this program by thanking all three of you for a wonderful discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Hopefully, sometime in the future, economic performance will matter and all of us will be sure of our jobs. Thank you very much, TCA, Jagu, and Arun, for joining me once again.